It turns cooler and fresher with temperatures returning closer to the seasonal norm. Showers in the north, sunnier in the south.
Drone strikes in Ukraine and Russia, prisoner exchanges and occasional rounds of negotiation, but still no sign of a ceasefire. Donald Trump said he could end this conflict, but he hasn't yet. For more on the war in Ukraine, join me, Paul Adams, here on BBC News.
Factories across China are rushing to make and ship their goods to the United States after a ceasefire was agreed between Beijing and Washington in their economic war. But how long will it last? Join me, Laura Bicker, as we gauge reaction across China for BBC News.
National Public Radio, NPR, is one of the most recognised names in US media, but President Trump accuses it of having a liberal bias. We've been speaking to the boss of NPR, who's planning a fight back against moves to cut its federal funding. That's all coming up on The Media Show on BBC News.
Live from London, this is BBC News. The UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves speaks to the BBC after setting out her new plan for spending, with a promise to invest in security, health and growing the economy.
And I'm Regina Vaidyanathan, live in Westminster with all of the political reaction. We'll be taking a look at who the winners and losers are in today's spending review.
2 nights of violence, 32 officers injured and 6 people arrested. Police in Northern Ireland call for peace in Ballymena.
For the second day, the focus of this mob violence has been upon our diverse communities and the police. This has no place in any right-thinking and civilised society.
US Marines take civil disturbance training ahead of their deployment on the streets of Los Angeles, where there's been unrest over President Trump's immigration crackdown. And the EU and UK agree a deal on the post-Brexit status of Gibraltar. Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh and you are watching Verified Live. It's a hugely significant day here in the UK because the Chancellor has been setting out how taxpayers' money will be spent by the government until the end of the decade. We're going to have lots of analysis for you, so let's cross straight to my colleague, Regina Vaidyanathan, who's in Westminster for us. Regina.
Thank you very much, Anita. Well, this, as you say, is a hugely significant day, not just politically, and we'll get into that in a moment, but also for people up and down the UK, because the Chancellor has set out which government departments are going to get a spending boost and which departments might not get as much as they had hoped for. To be clear, this wasn't a fiscal event, as they say, so there were no announcements on taxes. This was all about distributing the money that's already there. Now, the Chancellor confirmed that total departmental spending will grow by 2.3% over inflation per year. Well, she says the spending on the NHS will rise by 3% a year after inflation, and confirmed £39 billion for social and affordable housing. Rachel Reeves also committed to a boost in defence spending, something we'd heard about in recent weeks. She also talked about wanting to end funding for asylum hotels in the next 4 years. Well, as we were saying, there were winners and losers. Some departments didn't do as well as they might have hoped, including the Home Office, for example, and the Foreign Office. Well, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said she is rejecting austerity. party. With more, here's our political correspondent, Lowe.
When will we feel better off, Chancellor?
Soon, fingers crossed, is what she's thinking. Rachel Reeves leaving Downing Street this morning for Parliament for a crucial moment in her time in charge of the country's finances. Earlier, cabinet ministers met to hear how much money their departments have been allocated for the coming years, both for spending and investment. Some have done better than others. Trade-offs unavoidable with limited room for manoeuvre in economic terms.
I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
In the Commons this lunchtime, the Chancellor set out her stall.
We are renewing Britain. But I know that too many people in too many parts of our country are yet to feel it. This government's task, my task as Chancellor, and the purpose of this spending review is to change that, to ensure that renewal is felt in people's everyday lives, in their jobs and on their high streets. The priorities of this spending review are the priorities of working people.
She's giving day-to-day spending across all departments an above-inflation boost and said she was taking a different approach to that of the Tories.
In contrast to our increase of 2.3%, they cut spending by 2.9% per year in 2010. So let's be clear. Austerity was a destructive choice for the fabric of our society.
There are cuts to some departments, including Transport and the Foreign Office, but schools and defence have been given an uplift, and the NHS was the big winner.
This Labour government is making a record cash investment in our National Health Service, increasing real terms day-to-day spending by 3% per year for every single year of this spending review. An extra £29 billion per year for the day-to-day running of our health service.
The Chancellor also set out areas for longer-term investment, around £14 billion to build the Sizewell C nuclear power station in Suffolk, more than £15 billion on bus, tram and train networks in the north of England and the Midlands, £86 billion for research in the science and technology sector by the end of the Parliament, and £39 billion towards affordable homes in England.
The Chancellor is betting that voters and those within her own party who've recently questioned her judgment will be convinced by big numbers on investing for the longer term in the hope of generating growth over time. There is more spending money in some priority areas, but these are a delicate set of decisions that Rachel Reeves knows will define what this Labour government can do.
Opposition parties gave their response to the Chancellor's announcement.
This is the spend now, tax later review. Because the Right Honourable Lady knows she will need to come back here in the autumn with yet more taxes. And a cruel summer of speculation awaits.
We are still not seeing the scale of ambition needed to turn the country around. We welcome the announcement of investment in the NHS, but on its own, it won't work unless the government invests in social care too.
Rachel Reeves and her Treasury team are telling us what the state will provide under Labour and how much that will cost. Big choices that they say marks a new phase of this government. Leila Nathu, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in the last few minutes, we have been hearing from the Chancellor. She's been speaking to our political editor, Chris Mason. Let's have a listen.
Chancellor, thanks for your time today. People are impatient for things to improve. You campaigned promising change. A lot of this, though, is slow burn, long term, isn't it?
People are impatient for change, and I'm impatient for change as well after 14 years of Conservative government. It is why, for example, we are introducing free school meals for all children whose parents are on universal credit, which will come in the next school year. It's why we're rolling out breakfast clubs, and it's why we are substantially increasing the amount of money to insulate people's homes, to take money off people's energy bills.
Still long term. You'll make an argument that long term spending is savvy, but people have to inevitably wait for that.
Well, I'm not going to apologise for making the long-term decisions in our country's interest, but whether it's investment in things like new nuclear power stations or carbon capture and storage, or new transport investment in Manchester or Leeds or the North East, it may take time for those trams and those trains to arrive, but we'll have spades in the ground in this Parliament, creating good jobs for local people in communities all across the UK.
The Home Office budget is being cut at a time when the small boat crossings are out of control, and the police are saying this afternoon that they are being left short again. Is that really sensible, that squeeze in the Home Office?
Well, the police budget is going up by, the spending power for the police is going up by 2.3% a year.
They worry it's still going to amount to being really tough for them.
I recognise that not everyone has been able to get exactly what they want in this spending review, but we've allocated £190 billion more for day-to-day spending during this forecast period, more money for capital investment. We're not able to do everything that everyone would want, but real terms, spending power increases for the police of 2.3% a year, above inflation, enabling us to deliver on the commitments we made in our manifesto.
And on small boats and the Home Office budget being squeezed?
Well, the Home Office budget is coming down as we spend less on asylum accommodation. And it is really important that we get people out of those asylum hotels and that we deport people who have no right to be in this country. And that is why we see that spending on asylum hotels come down, and that money will be reinvested in our frontline public services rather than putting up asylum seekers in hotels.
I'm joined now by our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. Always good to have you on the BBC News channel, Alex. So we saw that interview there with Rachel Reeves. One thing she said to Chris was not everyone can get what they want. And we know that in the days running up to this, there were, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. No, I'm not.
Bless you in advance.
There were different government departments tussling over getting the biggest share of the pie. And we know the Home Office, for example, as Chris questioned the Chancellor on there, didn't get as much as it wanted, for example.
Yeah, overall, the Home Office budget is going down. Now, the argument that Rachel Reeves was making when she spoke to Chris was that actually spending for police is going to go up, but that does take into account an assumption that council tax, so the bit of the council tax that you pay for your police force, will go up as well. But broadly speaking, the Home Office budget is going to go down, and we have had some reaction from police already suggesting that they will look at the implication of that, but it may have an impact on what they can do as police forces. So while overall spending is going up, and it was the point that Chris was making there, a lot of this is investment in long-term projects, those capital projects, so the big nuclear power stations, the affordable housing, the roads and the trams and the trains. It's those day-to-day spending decisions where we might see a squeeze, and the question is, what impact will that have on public services that a lot of people rely on?
Indeed, and I was speaking to the Shadow Chancellor in the last hour, who believes that there'll be taxes coming down the road.
Yeah, the Conservatives have claimed this for a while, and you know, you'll be familiar that it's not entirely unheard of for a political party to claim the other political party might put your taxes up. That's quite a familiar line that we hear. But the Conservatives aren't the only ones who've indicated that at some point that might be the case. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, in the run-up to this spending statement, also made the argument that things can look tight. The Chancellor hasn't got a huge amount of wriggle room, and depending on what happens with the broader economy, then it may be the case that there might have to be some tax rises to come. Now, the government's been really clear. It said it in its manifesto, and it's repeated it since, that the three main taxes, as people call them, so it's income tax, national insurance and VAT, won't go up. And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, repeated that just last week. Beyond that, of course, they're saying this isn't about setting out tax plans today. This is about spending, not tax. That comes at the budget. So we'll have to see.
How much of a gamble do you think this is for her? Because she's increasing spending in key areas. Her critics say that she'll have to borrow more in the long term. What's your analysis?
I think there are two really interesting points out of this. I think one thing that we heard coming out of today is from the Prime Minister in the conversation that he had with his cabinet around the table this morning before the Chancellor's spending review, and then echoed again in what the Chancellor was saying. I think they're trying to suggest that after their first year in office, where they wouldn't say it, but it is known that some of the decisions they've taken haven't been popular with people. I think they're now trying to say, look, this is us moving on, and we're making decisions that for the long term are going to come good. And the other interesting thing about this is that decision about this focus on investment and spending for the future. You know, they think that if they do this, they'll get the economy growing. They think if the economy grows, they'll have more money for public services. But the question that sits behind that is, are people going to be patient enough to wait?
Okay, Alex Forsyth, thank you very much, our political correspondent there. You can, of course, hear Alex on any questions. Now, let's break down a little bit more about what we were talking about with Alex there, and that is that the Home Office hasn't really come out very well in terms of getting a big boost in funding. Let's discuss that with our Home Editor, Mark Easton. Mark, it's good to talk to you. We saw in that interview there with Chris Mason and the Chancellor, one of the things that she talked about, which is reducing the spending on asylum hotels. How practical is that?
Well, they are now promising. We now have an actual commitment, a pledge to end the use of asylum hotels by the end of this Parliament in 2029. For some people, that's not nearly quick enough. They say these hotels are totally unsuitable and hugely expensive. But nevertheless, there are others who worry that we won't be able to get there even in that time. I think it's practical if two things happen, and this is certainly the kind of formula that's being applied both in the Home Office and the Treasury. One, we have to reduce the pressure on the system. We have to stop more of those boats from reaching the UK, fewer asylum seekers coming into the system, and the Home Office is hopeful that there are measures in place which will do that, not least a change in the rules for the French police to be able to stop life rafts crossing the channel up to 300 metres from shore. They think that might be a game changer. The other aspect of this is the supply. That basically, really over the last 10-15 years, we have not produced enough extra dispersal accommodation, as it's called, specifically for asylum seekers, and that's why we've had to move them into hotels. So one of the things that the Chancellor has announced today is that there will be extra money for the Housing Ministry to actually build some dispersal accommodation to house more asylum seekers, not in hotels.
And what about the other things when it comes to the Home Office, for example, funding the police?
Yes, well, the police have been very active, I'm sure you will remember, over the last few weeks in saying that without having a substantial increase in their budgets, they were going to struggle to be able to keep the government's promises on extra officers, particularly neighbourhood patrols, or indeed the government's pledge to halve knife crime and halve violence against women and girls. There was an expectation that perhaps it could be as low as a 2% increase in police budgets. In the end, they got 2.3%. That's perhaps still not a number that the police forces themselves will be very happy with. They are talking about actually having to introduce some serious sort of limits on what they can actually do. Prioritization, they're talking about up and down the country. Some crimes will not be able to be investigated. They won't be able to recruit as many people as they want, and that's despite this real terms 2.3% increase in police funding.
OK, Mark Easton, our Home Editor, thank you very much for taking us through the changes when it comes to funding for the Home Office. Well, let's turn to what's arguably the department which is the biggest winner in today's spending review, and that is the Health Service. Well, joining me now is Hugh Alderwick, Director of Policy at the Health Foundation. It's an independent think tank. Welcome to BBC News, Hugh. Pleased with what you heard today?
Well, given the pressures on public finances, this is a good settlement for the NHS. About 3% growth every year should be enough to keep up with growing demand for services from an ageing, growing population, make some improvements, but it's still going to be tight. 3% by historic standards is not high, it's lower than the average, and the government's assuming that the NHS can make productivity improvements, do more with the spending it's got. But capital spending, investment in buildings, equipment, IT, the staff, doctors, nurses, receptionists need to do their jobs properly. Looks like it's going to be broadly flat for the rest of the Parliament, so boosting productivity will be hard. So yes, a generous settlement, particularly compared to other areas of spending, but still going to be tight.
How can this settlement in today's spending review help bring down waiting lists, which is something that the government's really trying to work on?
This should go some way to doing that. As I say, this is a generous settlement, should allow the health service to do more to get through that backlog, but whether it can do it depends on other factors, not just the amount of money going in. How many staff are recruited, whether they stay, whether they've got the skills and equipment needed to tackle the waiting list, and also what happens with the health of the population. So it's still going to be really tight. It also depends on what happens in other public services. It's not particularly clear from the documents what will happen with social care spending, but it looks like that's going to be a tight settlement too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because the two go hand in hand, but the settlement doesn't look like, as you say, it's going to be as generous for social care.
That's right. So the social care system in this country is a threadbare safety net. It desperately needs money and reform. It looks like what's been promised, as I say, not particularly clear from the documents, is going to be enough to keep up with growing demand, not reform the system, not radically improve it. The government said it's committed to paying care workers more, that's good. But again, it's not clear where the money's going to come from and if it's there. So I think social care is going to continue to struggle. And really improving the health over the long run is not just about the NHS. So a generous settlement for the health service. But if other public services are struggling around it, particularly adult social care, then we're going to still see challenges getting through that waiting list and keeping people healthy.
Okay, thank you very much, Hugh. Well, I think Hugh touched on what really has been the theme of the day here in Westminster, which is that there have been some winners and there have been some losers, and that is the nature of how these things work. When you're trying to allocate a pot of money, you cannot please everyone. Well, there is more on the BBC News website. We've got plenty of analysis from our specialist correspondents who specialise, like Mark Easton, for example, in the different government departments. So they're breaking down how the spending review will impact areas like defence, for example, as well, which has done quite well today. We've also got more on the interview that Chris Mason did with the Chancellor on that live page as well. Plenty more comments from opposition parties as well. So you can go to our live page to get plenty more. That's it from us in Westminster for the moment. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
Six people have been arrested and one charged following violent protests in Ballymena in County Antrim. The unrest began on Monday after two boys speaking through a Romanian interpreter appeared in court to face a sexual assault charge, which they deny. In the past hour, we've heard from the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Assistant Chief Constable Ryan Henderson appealed for the violence to end.
For the second day, the focus of this mob violence has been upon our diverse communities and the police. This has no place in any right-thinking and civilised society. Let me say in the clearest possible terms, this senseless violence is utterly unacceptable, and as I see it, serves only to endanger lives and destroy our local area, our local communities. And I want to appeal directly to those involved or considering becoming involved in the disorder to stop and think. Ask yourselves, is the hatred something you want to be associated with? Is this worth being prosecuted for? Is it worth your future being put under threat, or indeed the future of your children? Most importantly, please ask yourself, how are these criminal acts, how are they helping the ongoing criminal investigation in support of a young victim who deserves justice?
The British government and the European Union have reached a deal over the future status of Gibraltar. The UK says the deal will avoid the need for checks on people and goods moving between Gibraltar and Spain. As a British overseas territory with a land border with the EU, Gibraltar's status has been left effectively unresolved since Brexit until now. An overnight curfew, which has been in force in Los Angeles since 8 p.m. local time on Tuesday, has ended. Police had issued dispersal orders and say they made mass arrests after 5 successive days of protests. President Trump deployed the National Guard and Marines, despite opposition from California's governor and officials in LA. The White House says the extra force was needed to protect border control agents as they carry out immigration raids. We've also heard from Major General Scott Sherman, who says 700 Marines are preparing to be deployed, but won't be on the ground in Los Angeles on Wednesday. With regards to the National Guard, he said that the troops are there strictly to protect federal buildings and personnel and to assist law enforcement to carry out their duties.
They're allowed to temporarily detain and wait for law enforcement to come and arrest them. They do not do any arrest. They are strictly there to detain, to wait for law enforcement to come and handle those demonstrators.
Major General Scott Sherman. The European Space Agency has released never-before-seen video and images of the Sun. The ESA's Solar Orbiter spacecraft has sent back the first pictures of the solar South Pole. The new images are important because they will allow scientists to get a better picture of why the Sun's poles switch from north to south and back again every 11 years, and how this affects life on Earth. Here's our science correspondent, Palab Ghosh.
A view of the Sun that's never been seen before, its South Pole. The shimmering bright atmosphere is its hottest part at 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. The darker, lofted clouds are cooler wisps of gas, but still at a searing several thousand degrees. The pictures have been taken by the European Space Agency's Solar Orbiter spacecraft. They're the closest and most detailed ever taken, and they'll help scientists learn how the star that gives us life on Earth actually works.
So this is humanity's first ever glimpse of the poles of the Sun. And this is really important because the Sun's magnetic field has an 11-year cycle where it starts off at north-south and then flips to south-north. And to really understand this cycle, what we've been missing and what we're going to get now is images of the magnetic field at the poles of the Sun.
From Earth, the Sun seems like a bright, featureless disk. But at certain frequencies, space telescopes can reveal its detailed structure, how magnetic fields twist and turn on its surface to create solar flares and loops of gas. No one really knows how these magnetic fields work because scientists are unable to see how they move and shift on the north and south poles. But now they can.
You see these radial structures. That's what you'll see more at the poles.
It's these magnetic fields that determine when the Sun rages and spits out particles towards the Earth. This space weather can damage communication satellites and power grids and cause beautiful auroras.
The reversal of the polar magnetic fields on the Sun is, for me, I think, one of the big open questions in science. And what we'll be able to do with Solar Orbiter is measure, for the first time, really important fluid flows that grab pieces of the magnetic field of the Sun and transport them to the polar regions.
The new research will help scientists learn more about our closest star and predict its raging moods. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
Amazing images. Do stay with us here on BBC News because we have lots more coming up when we'll be answering your questions about the UK Chancellor's spending review today.
Hello there. Warm and humid is the forecast for the next few days for all areas, but particularly so for England and Wales. But this combination of heat and humidity is likely to set off some heavy and thundery downpours, which will be pushing up from the south. Now, we've got high pressure over the near continent drawing this warm and humid air from France, and low pressure and weather fronts out in the Atlantic trying to make inroads and destabilising the atmosphere. So tonight most places will be dry, warm and muggy. We'll start to see some heavy showers and thunderstorms pushing up across the Channel Islands into southwest England and South Wales. Some of these could be heavy, risk of some localised flooding. Double figure values for all. So we start Thursday off on a warm and humid note. We'll have showers and thunderstorms from the word go across southwest England. These pushing into Wales, Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland as we head into the afternoon. And again, some of them could be heavy with a risk of some localised flooding. But elsewhere, it stays dry and sunny with some variable cloud. Top temperatures again around the mid-20s and feeling humid. Friday, probably the peak of the heat, especially the southeast of England. We'll see some sunshine here, scattered thundery downpours developing pretty widely, spreading their way northwards through the course of the day. Top temperatures, high 20s in the southeast. We could hit the 30 Celsius mark low 20s further north and west. But as we head into the weekend, the Atlantic winds out, it turns cooler and fresher with temperatures returning closer to the seasonal norm. Showers in the north, sunnier in the south.
Disinformation.
There is no climate.
You think you're winning.
The pandemic wasn't real.
Fooling people in the most sophisticated ways.
Control from Met Police. Social media posts.
You fueled hate and confusion. And you make our job seem almost impossible.
Fake news.
Almost. You see, it's because of you we get up in the morning and work through the night. All over the world. The more you try to drown out reality, the harder we'll work to verify the facts. We will find your sleights of hand and expose them. So no matter how hard it gets, we'll never give up. We'll be watching. We'll be ready. It's the pursuit of truth that gives us our calling. The fight for truth is on.
Today we're looking at the state of British politics.
Asking, is technology ruining football?
Are we too obsessed with our phones?
Helen from Hull wants to know, how hot's the planet going to get?
And we'll explain why prices keep going up and up.
Also, Rach, did you know space has its own smell?
Really? What of? The world is fast-moving and can be confusing.
So let's talk about it.
5 Live Breakfast with Rachel and Rick. Listen on BBC Sounds.
This is frontier country.
Broaden your horizons.
If this is what being a 21st century nomad is all about, sign me up.
Caribbean's relationship with the seas are changing and deepen your understanding.
What must it have been like for them, not knowing whether they were going to make it? How important is this region?
If something starts changing here, we see the change all over the world.
This is just incredible.
The Travel Show. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Be ready. Change can happen in an instant. Check on the BBC Weather app.
It's time for Your Voice, Your BBC. And joining me in the studio today to answer your questions about the Chancellor's spending review are BBC Verify's policy and analysis correspondent Ben Shue, our cost of living correspondent Kevin Peachy, and the Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Ben Zaranko. Ben and Kevin, welcome to all of you. We have a lot of questions to get through, so let's crack on. And we'll begin with you, Ben Shue. Where is the money to pay for all this spending coming from, asks an anonymous questioner.
Right, well, it's a great one to kick us off, isn't it? So I think the short answer is it's coming from a combination of extra borrowing by the government and extra taxes by the government. So to broaden out on that, effectively the envelope for what we've seen distributed today was set in the budget last year by Rachel Reeves, and in that budget she essentially said she was going to borrow an extra 2%, so she was going to spend an extra 2% of GDP on a combination of day-to-day spending and capital spending, and she was going to raise an extra 1% roughly a year of GDP in taxation. Remember the national insurance rise, that was the bulk of it, and she was also going to borrow an extra 1% of GDP. So you put that all together and that explains how they are going to pay for this spending that they've allocated to different departments today.
OK, well, that is a very good question, I guess, to kick off this discussion. Let's get into some specifics then. And the NHS, one of the winners, I guess, out of today's spending review. Ben Zaranko, we have this question from Julia in Preston, asking what's been done about NHS wastage. Whilst I applaud money for the NHS, I believe that there is huge wastage there too.
It's a great question. The NHS is a big budget. It's hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds. It's about 40% of all the money that the government spends on public services. And within that, of course, there will be inefficiencies and waste. And today there was promises of additional cash for the NHS, but that cash is coming with strings attached. The government is asking the NHS to make what they call productivity improvements of about 2% per year. So that's with the same amount of cash and staff and resources, deliver 2% more care, basically. And they're also seeking some quite large savings, actually, from the NHS, what you might think of as the back office budget, almost the bureaucracy, of about 10 to 15% by the end of the Parliament. And those are really quite chunky savings. I suppose one risk is if you cut back on those managers and those people who are doing the stuff behind the scenes, eventually that might start to have a knock-on impact on the frontline staff. Maybe their rota doesn't get done on time. Maybe some of the organisation doesn't work quite as well. So there's a risk there, but the government is seeking efficiency savings and to cut down on waste in a big way.
And just before I come to you, Kevin, I'm going to skip ahead to another question on my list because it's very much related to this theme. And a lot of people will want to know if there's lots more money going into the NHS, is that going to mean that there will be more appointments available with GPs or appointments available with dentists? What's the answer to that question? Do we know?
Well, that's certainly the hope. There's a lot more cash going in. There's going to be lots more detail in the 10-year plan for the NHS. The government will be publishing probably in the next few weeks with a bit more detail on what sorts of care they want to focus on, what the priorities will be. But they've said explicitly today they want to provide more hospital appointments. They've already provided 2 million more since they're coming into power. They want to build on that to try and get NHS waiting lists down. They've promised hundreds of thousands more dentist appointments and they've promised to hire more GPs. So if this money is spent well, you would hope that would feed through to it being easier to see a doctor, being easier to get into the hospital and so on.
Yeah, that would be one thing that I think would make the public say that they can really see the impacts of spending on the NHS. But let's see how that trickles down or in what way it might trickle down. Now, cost of living is often related, Kevin, isn't it, to being able to get on the housing ladder or the cost of rent and so forth. This question comes from Mick, who says 39 billion on affordable housing. Brilliant. But what exactly does that mean, he asks? My daughter-in-law is on 60k and got turned down for a mortgage as she is single. If someone on 60k can't buy anything, just who can?
Yeah, I think we have loads of questions, don't we, on NHS appointments, but housing's right up there as well. And so there's big announcements today, 39 billion, as you say, on social housing. There's interestingly in there's a guarantee for social landlords on how much they can charge in rent. That's really important because that 1% above inflation for the next 10 years. What that means is they can then say, right, we're going to put this amount of money aside for house building. And as we know, the government's got these very, tough housing targets on building 1.5 million homes by 2030. They're going to meet that. I noticed that Ben, surrounded by Bens, but that Ben has got his spending review booklet in there, and something specifically for Mick in there. There's one line which is about.
There it is. There it is. I'm holding it up so we can see this. This document, lots of detail in there.
I've done my homework.
Yeah, we spend our day going through that stuff, so you don't have to. But in there, one line about the mortgage guarantee scheme. Now, that's coming to an end of June, and what that means is that there will be there are mortgages that can go up to 95% loan to value. So people with just a 5% deposit can get on the housing ladder. The kind of thing that Mick's talking about there. That's coming to an end at the end of June, but the government has said that is going to continue permanently beyond that. No great detail in there, but another sort of confirmation, if you like, that that guarantee is going to be in there and hopefully help first-time buyers.
And on a theme as well, Kevin, Patricia from Eastbourne asks, when the 1.5 million new homes are completed, will you prohibit investors rushing in to grab and buy up these new, in inverted commas, affordable homes so they can be added to their rental portfolio?
Yeah, loads of questions about the house building targets, whether they're achievable, what's going to happen at the end of it, is it going to affect house prices and so on. There's obviously a lot of money going into this, but as Ben was saying earlier about the spending envelope, I guess it's a great example, isn't it, of how there's this money going into the spending envelope, but what's really crucial is whether that envelope is going to be delivered and the cost of the stamp on it almost, and whether that's really going to happen. And so, yeah, big questions over house building, whether it's going to happen and where those houses are and what's going to happen to them.
Do you want to come in on that, Ben?
I think just a bit of context on that £39 billion figure, because it obviously sounds like a lot for affordable housing. That's actually spread over 10 years, we understand. So probably about £4 billion a year, which is roughly double what the grant was going into affordable and social housing before. So it is a big increase, but not perhaps quite as big as it sounds. sounds. And it's worth putting it in context again. People in the housing industry were saying you probably needed to put maybe 10, 11 billion pounds a year of grant to try and hit the targets which the government has set for building more social housing. So undoubtedly a step up, but perhaps not meeting what is required.
Benchu, saying with you, we have a question about defence, and of course defence has been very much in the headlines, hasn't it, especially since Donald Trump came back to the White House. He's been putting pressure on other members of NATO to increase their spending on defence. So this question comes from Liam in Dublin, who asks, how much will be spent on defence? Yeah,
well, it's a very straight question, and the straight answer is that by 28-29 it will be about £73.5 billion. That's including the day-to-day spending of paying for squaddies and the soldiers, and also the kit that they are going to get. Considerable uplift. Of course, the government's made a commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027. That's why it is going up to those kind of figures. But a bit of context again, of course, the government has an ambition for 3%. This is only flatlining at 2.5%.
And some criticism directed at the government that they haven't pinpointed exactly when that 3% target will be reached.
That's right. And also, as we know, NATO is saying 3.5% should be the target for member states. Donald Trump wants 5%. So this is a big increase in defence spending. But again, is it going to be enough to meet the ambitions and the requirements on the UK? That's another question.
Ben Zaranko, a question for you. Why is Scotland getting more than Wales and Northern Ireland, asks someone anonymously.
Well, it's a very good question. And I think it's worth saying that most of the announcements today in the spending review, not all, but most were focused on England. It was a spending review set by the Westminster government with regard to the things that they have control over. Lots of services in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are devolved, and the responsibility of the devolved parliaments. And the way that funding is allocated is by something called the Barnett formula. It's basically by a formula, by an equation, which is based on the population shares of different parts of the country and on the sorts of services their local governments are responsible for providing. And because Scotland has a bigger population than Wales or Northern Ireland, the formula, when you spend more in England, as the government is doing, will give more to Scotland than it will to Wales or Northern Ireland. So it's not so much a specific decision Rachel Reeves has made, it's because of this long-standing formula which dates back to the 1970s, and that sort of governs how much goes to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland to spend however they like. They don't have to spend it in the same way that the Westminster government is.
And that was, I think, a very clear explanation of what can be quite a complex subject, trying to understand the formulas for spending. Kevin?
Just to give you a specific example as well, when we look at the problems that the government's had over winter fuel payments, well, this week they announced this U-turn, and the policies are slightly different depending on where you are in the UK. So England and Wales, they have this U-turn, and they'll say, more than 3/4 of pensioners will now receive the payment. But in the meantime, there were changes in Scotland, and they came up with a different policy, and now that's probably going to be reconsidered again. The same in Northern Ireland. So you can see, although the funding is put in different pots, if you like, and goes to the different countries, then the policies can then become quite confused, especially if they chop and change.
OK, I'm ticking off the questions as I ask them. Still quite a few to go. This one for you, Benchu, on the Bank of England base rate. Ian from Bristol asks, in an ideal world, what would be the optimum Bank of England base rate, i.e. the best compromise between savers and borrowers? It's difficult to, keep everyone happy all of the time, isn't it?
It's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer because the Bank of England sets short-term interest rates at a level which it thinks the economy can handle without inflation getting out of control. And it's not ex ante clear before you actually know what's going to happen, what that level should be. I mean, for context, it's about 4.25% at the moment. As Rachel Reeves pointed out, it's come down quite a lot over the last year or so, 4 cuts. Some economists think it could come down to 3.25% by the end of the year. But that's really speculation because it will depend on what the Bank of England committee, which sets interest rates, think will be the sustainable rate to stop inflation going above its 2% target.
And I guess it depends as well, doesn't it, on to what extent the spending review delivers the kind of economic growth that the Chancellor hopes it will.
Yes, in the longer term, that's absolutely right. That will determine the rate of interest rates. I think, to be clear, though, there's nothing new in this particular statement on the demand side in the economy because it was all set last year. So we'll see what longer term impact on growth these measures have. And that will obviously, as you say, have an impact ultimately on interest rates as well.
And the worth remembering, of course, that most of us, well, most people are savers and borrowers. So, they're affected in different ways. Not a case of a trade-off between savers and then a different group of people who are borrowers. There are lots of people with mortgages and savings who have, had to balance that all out as interest rates have changed.
Very good point, Kevin. And the next question to you, another anonymous one, bringing us back to housing. Since house building has a huge carbon footprint, how do you build 1.5 million homes a year and reach net zero targets? Did we learn much about that today?
No, not a great deal. It's a tricky one for the government. There's a whole host of issues about that target, not least, are there enough brickies out there, that kind of thing. So I think that's going to be chewed over as that target continues to be challenged. And we'll see whether they can do it in a carbon neutral way.
There was a question from Chris Sturman in Lincoln who says it's all very well building new houses, but who is going to build them, saying that there's a serious shortage of bricklayers, plumbers and electricians.
Yeah, absolutely. As Kevin said, there are big concerns in the industry about the numbers available, and obviously the government wants to bring down net migration when a lot of these construction workers in the past have come from overseas. So there's a bit of a tension there in terms of the government's ambitions when it comes to housing delivery and migration. Just a point on the net zero point, I think the government would actually try and flip that on its head, because the reality is, if we are going to meet our net zero targets, we have to radically change the way our homes are powered from gas boilers. They would say putting in heat pumps in new homes is a crucial way of driving that decarbonisation overall for the UK. So I think they would regard it more of an opportunity rather than a danger, but we'll see.
OK, Ben Zaranko, the next one for you. This is about policing, the next question, and it comes from Steve, who asks, what does the Chancellor's spending review mean for policing? Frontline policing can't keep up with increasing demands. Do we now face reducing budgets or reducing spending in policing for the next 3 years?
The short answer is police funding won't be going down over the next 3 years in England and Wales, which is what today's announcement's covered, going back to our previous question. Police spending power, which is a function of both the funding they get from central government, but also the local taxes and precepts that are paid to pay for local policing services, mean that funding will grow by a little over 2% per year, above inflation over this Parliament, a little less than 2% over the next couple of years. So that's not cuts. The question then becomes, is it enough to deliver the improvements the government wants to see and to deliver...
Which is where we get to the slightly longer answer, I suspect. Just give us a sense of what that is, where that goes.
As the questioner asked or mentioned, the police are under great pressures. Crime is getting more complicated. Crime rates have ticked up. There's lots of concern, particularly about types of theft, but also types of online crimes and fraud. Meeting all of those demands at once within this envelope will prove tricky. They will have to face tricky trade-offs, and if the government wants to recruit more police officers, if you also want to pay them more, can you manage both of those things within the same budget? We'll have to wait and see. And so I think that it won't be everything the police were hoping for, but perhaps it could have been worse. OK. Kevin, one for you. This is on travel, specifically train travel. This is from Lakshmi, who says, the rail card is expensive. In many countries, the rail fare is cheaper and affordable. Why is there no cap on rail fares? And I think with some of the questions, obviously, we're trying to interpret in a way what we've heard from the Chancellor today in the spending review to see what that might mean for a particular area of interest. And obviously lots of people are very, very interested in the cost of getting around by train.
Yeah, and a big chunk of the speech today actually was about transport and about rail links and about bus fare caps and so on. Quite a lot in there. So
more I think, though, on how that can be a driver for growth and for jobs rather than necessarily what it's going to mean for fares.
Absolutely. All about investment. And a lot of the speech today, a lot of what's in that book is about something that's happening over the the long term. And I think the frustration for many commuters is the cost. So, the rail card went up by £5 in March for many people, and regulated rail fares. There are some which are regulated, like season tickets, for example. They went up by more than 4% in England and Wales, nearly 4% in Scotland. And I think the frustration for many people who use the rail services is, yes, the cost is going up, but the service is, bedevilled by delays and cancellations, and they feel as though they're getting frankly a bit of a rubbish service for what they're paying. And so I think the Chancellor was concentrating on that long-term investment into some of these services, looking at Liverpool to Manchester rail link, looking at projects to upgrade rail services in Wales and so on. So I think that's where the concentration was, and we had that bus fare cap as well. There's obviously millions of people who use the bus to get to work.
Mm-hmm. If anyone hasn't caught up on that, remind us what that one said. So what the Chancellor said about that.
So the cap, which went up from on most single bus fares in England, the cap went up from £2 to £3 in October. After much speculation, it will now stay at £3 until at least March 2027. So a little bit of certainty for people who use the bus, which is a real lifeline in many areas for people to get to work.
OK, so a bit more detail on bus fares, not so much on train fares. Ben Zarenko, this question asks, an anonymous one, asks, will lifting the council tax cap make it unaffordable? We're going to pivot back to a couple of housing-related questions now. So will lifting the council tax cap make it unaffordable?
Well, it's worth thinking of what might happen to council tax first. And buried in the document, you can be forgiven for missing it, is an assumption that councils will raise council tax by 5% per year. The government's publishing this number saying local government spending will go up by 3% a year. That's predicated on them raising council tax by the maximum possible amount. Now, for some families, that may well be very tricky on their budget. That may well force difficult choices on other things might have to be sacrificed. No one likes to see higher tax. Councils don't like raising council tax, but they're doing it in the face of considerable pressures on their budgets, particularly from things like adult social care and children's social care, where if the government's not providing much money from the centre, raising local taxes is how they make the sums add up.
OK, and then we have this one from Lynn Astle in Sheffield, Kevin, who says we have plenty of new homes being built in Sheffield, but no social housing. Is it down to local government to ensure that at least part of new building schemes relate to social housing, or does the housing minister need to put pressure on them to ensure that they don't get building permission unless a percentage is for social housing? So we've already discussed in an earlier question the topic of affordable housing. Did we hear anything today that answers that question for Lynn?
And it's all part of that. So it's part of the same announcement. So they add more money into social housing, into affordable housing, and certainly on a political sense, there was pressure, we understand, from the Deputy Prime Minister on trying to get that in. And so lots of questions, I think, about the funding for social housing, but also where it's put. Lynn there in Sheffield probably wants to see it in Sheffield, and I suspect if you go around every other city in the country, they will say, well, we'd like it here too. So it's one thing saying there's going to be house building targets, but if those houses are beyond affordable for many people, then that's a whole different issue.
And another anonymous question related to housing, which asks, why are we continuing to throw money at new builds when so many properties are lying empty and run down? Instead of pumping money into building houses with no infrastructure around them, why don't we make grants available for people to renovate empty houses? Ben Chu, if you could maybe take that question.
Well, this is a line which a lot of people have used over the years, saying we don't need more housing, we can just use the vacant stock. And I think it's the analysis I've seen is based, it's a bit of a misconception about the ability of that stock to actually provide the housing that people really need. You need a bit of vacant stock because not everyone is going to be occupying a house at the same time. They may be in the process of selling it, for instance. So you do need a bit of slack. If every house was occupied, that wouldn't be a sign of a well-functioning housing market. I think most of the analysis which has been done is that you really do need to increase the supply quite drastically. Whether the government's target is appropriate or not, there's a lot of analysts out there who'd say you need to go even further than the 1.5 million new homes homes actually to make a real dent in the affordability problems that people have when it comes to housing.
And Ben Zaranko, do you want to come in on that one?
Just to say that as well as the number of houses, we should also think about how they're used and the incentives created by the tax system, for example, where stamp duty really discourages people from moving homes, because when you move, you have to pay this whacking big tax bill. So let's say your children have moved out, you've got a couple of spare bedrooms, you could downsize, but the tax system basically says, don't do it. And maybe we could think about incentives like that to encourage the houses we do have to be maybe used more efficiently.
And specifically in the spending review, there is some money for improving insulation in existing homes as well. Those kinds of things, which the idea being obviously it improves homes and it makes them cheaper to run, brings down energy use, hopefully brings down some of those bills for people too, which clearly is looming over this whole thing. The cost of living still a struggle for many, many people.
It's actually really interesting, isn't it, to see quite how many of these questions, obviously it's not necessarily a scientific survey, but interesting to see how many of these questions coming in for this question and answer session are on the subject of housing in one form or another. Kevin, I know you've been writing in I think people can look to the BBC website and app to see your latest article there about how people who work in the public sector might be affected by today's announcements, and also about the issue of more free school meals. Talk us through those.
Yes, so two different things. We've got the pressure on jobs and wages. I mean, there will be people watching with great interest on which departments were winners and which department were losers. Excellent video about that from Ben.
I'm coming on to that in a minute.
But in that, there's obviously among the winners probably some more job security, some more job creation. Among the losers, where budgets are squeezed, then maybe those wages will be squeezed as well. That sort of opportunity for new jobs could be less as well. So, for example, science and tech seeing quite a lot of investment going in. You might think that there is some job creation in that area. Somewhere like rural affairs, which has had its budget squeezed a bit more, maybe less so. So that's sort of almost an indirect impact on some of this. But clearly, it's for people in the public sector. But then there are lots of connected businesses in the private sector who will be affected too.
And school meals, briefly, just a very quick word on those.
Yeah, as previously announced over the last few days, in the big build-up to this, increase in free school meals for children of parents on universal credit in England from next September.
OK, Ben and Ben, about 45 seconds each for this last two questions. Winners and losers, Ben Chu?
OK, so we looked at this earlier. Big winners, I suppose, are health and social care. Education gets 0.7%. Defence, of course, we've talked about that. This is day-to-day spending, but the big losers that we've identified, departments like environment, day-to-day spending going to decline by an average of minus 2.7%. As a result of this spending review. Transport minus 5%, that's a particularly large one. And Angela Rayner's department, day-to-day spending, housing communities down 1.4%, and on average every year.
And Ben Zaranko, obviously the conditions in about a year since Labour came back to power have changed economically, not least to do with President Trump's tariffs and so forth. This document, this spending review today, it is a living, breathing thing, isn't it? It's going to change. It's going to have to adapt.
It may adapt a bit, but this is the whole point, is to try and set out plans for the rest of the Parliament, give departments and public services budgets and say, here you are, live within them, deliver the services, go and do your thing. And they will be hoping they don't have to revisit them. Now, if circumstances change enough, of course, perhaps, but I think the hope will be these could be fixed for a few years, worry about something else for a bit, and we'll see in the autumn.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to thank our viewers, first of all, for sending in those questions. We hope you got a lot of useful information. Ben Chu, Ben Zaranko and Kevin Peachy, thank you very much. You're watching BBC Verified Live. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello there. Warm and humid is the forecast for the next few days for all areas, but particularly so for England and Wales. But this combination of heat and humidity is likely to set off some heavy and thundery downpours, which will be pushing up from the south. Now, we've got high pressure over the near continent, drawing this warm and humid air from France, and low pressure and its weather fronts out in the Atlantic, trying to make inroads and destabilising the atmosphere. So tonight, most places will be dry, warm and muggy. We'll start to see some heavy showers and thunderstorms pushing up across the Channel Islands into southwest England and South Wales. Some of these could be heavy, risk of some localised flooding. Double figure values for all. So we start Thursday off on a warm and humid note. We'll have showers and thunderstorms from the word go across southwest England. These pushing into Wales, Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland as we head into the afternoon. And again, some of them could be heavy with the risk of some localised flooding. But elsewhere, it stays dry and sunny with some variable cloud. Top temperatures again around the mid-20s and feeling humid. Friday, probably the peak of the heat, especially the southeast of England. We'll see some sunshine here, scattered thundery downpours developing pretty widely, spreading their way northwards through the course of the day. Top temperatures, high 20s in the southeast. We could hit the 30 Celsius mark, low 20s further north and west. But as we head into the weekend, the Atlantic winds out, it turns cooler and fresher with temperatures returning closer to the seasonal norm. Showers in the north, sunnier in the south.
Newscast is different to the stuff that we all do in our day jobs because it's like a proper chat.
Something big's just happened.
And then we're just like, right, gonna do an episode.
We've all tried to get together.
We're just all working something out, and then you sort of have a eureka moment.
What you need to know when you need to know it.
Newscast. Listen every day on BBC Sounds.
When the weather can't make up its mind, we can help you make up yours. Check on the BBC Weather app.
This is better known to you and me as a flying car.
This is not your typical farm. It's food of the future.
A highly secure facility that monitors foreign governments' attempts to destabilise democracy.
Why are we so suited and booted for this task?
The idea is to learn more about how volcanoes behave so that we can better predict eruptions. This is a prime location for big companies to show us their latest products.
I'm going to go in and have a look. Using technology, distribution is now 98% efficient.
This is the potential of electric power in the marine industry.
Can we fire it up?
Once we close the doors behind us, no one can hear you scream.
I better not touch it anymore. This is one of the most incredible things I've ever done.
I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
Tech Now. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Tonight at 6, the Chancellor sets out how she plans to spend more than £1 trillion of public money over the next 4 years.
In place of decline, I choose investments. In place of pessimism, division and defeatism, I choose national renewal.
The Chancellor has completely lost control. This is the spend now, tax later review.
We've found out a lot today about the government's priorities between now and the next general election. We'll unpick what they're focusing on and what they're not.
Yes, from health, transport and housing to big infrastructure projects, we will be taking you through their plans. Also tonight, Police Scotland says it will send officers to Northern Ireland after they call for more support following a second night of violence in Ballymena. It's just been announced that the singer-songwriter Brian Wilson, who created the Beach Boys, has died at the age of 82. And spectacular new images of the sun's south pole and why scientists are so excited about them.
Coming up on BBC News, with 1 year to go until the World Cup, Thomas Tuchel says don't panic as England lose for the first time under their new manager.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Chancellor has unveiled her much anticipated spending review, laying out how she is going to divide up more than £1 trillion of public money between government departments over the next 4 years. Rachel Reeves also set out more than £100 billion in additional funding for long-term projects like nuclear power, defence and transport. Overall, government department budgets will grow by 2.3% over inflation per year. Though not all of them. Some, like the Department for Environment, the Foreign Office and the Home Office, get less, while Defence, Health and Science and Technology get more, some of them a lot more. The NHS in England gets an extra £29 billion a year for day-to-day running. That's more than expected. There's £39 billion for social and affordable housing in England over 10 years. And the Chancellor said that by 2029, hotels would no longer be used to house asylum seekers, saving £1 billion a year. The Conservatives described the Chancellor's plans as a spend now, tax later review. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is in Westminster with the latest.
Yes, hello, evening to you, Sophie. Here it is then, Spending Review 2025, all 128 pages of it to digest in the coming hours and days. What today was not was a budget. It was not about your taxes. It wasn't about how much extra you'll pay to buy a pint in the pub tonight. Instead, this was about the allocation of money that the government is setting aside for various budgets over the coming years. And there was a curiosity, an emphasis on the long term, when governments are often criticised for not focusing on the long term. In short, this was a bet on growth and patience in an era where there isn't much of either.
It's 8 o'clock on Wednesday, the 11th of June.
It's one of those noisy days at Westminster with big questions.
Chris, what bets has she made? What do they tell us?
Yeah, morning to you, Emma. So I think the key bet is... But frankly, first thing, my answers only get so far. When we get the numbers, the spreadsheets and the graphs, we will have a sense of what the government's priorities actually are. In Downing Street, a sense of choreography as we await the shape of the bodywork of the state, public services, for the years ahead.
When will we feel better off, Chancellor?
Of all the questions this morning, that one, the most important.
I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Rachel Reeves.
We are renewing Britain. But I know that too many people in too many parts of our country are yet to feel it. And the purpose of this spending review is to change that.
The emphasis today was on long-term spending, capital spending as it's known, or investment as the Chancellor repeatedly called it, including this on what's described as affordable housing.